Hi there, welcome to a Lemon Amiga special. In fact, we go back to the past and we take a look at the history behind our cartoon intro. And it all started when I first joined Lemon Amiga way back in 2009, and I wrote reviews and I commented on the Lemon Amiga forum, and then I became so involved with Lemon Amiga and guys were getting bored and pulling out. I eventually took over the Lemon Amiga Games competition, and in the meantime I started producing videos. And the idea of the videos was just to see how far I could get after so many years, and to get as far as I could to show as much of the game as possible, not necessarily to show my playing skills. So here we go, this is 2011, I began this project in September, and as you can see it began ordinarily enough in a paint package, and yes, this was initially began on didnt, but I then shifted over to a PC package. I created the colours in the backgrounds, and yes, I created a silly jagged line which eventually turned into the mountains. I did not rip any of this off a game at this point, and you can also see that I originally intended that two panes would merge into each other and I could show characters on both sides, and instead of the time frame moving along, it would simply dip down below the horizon and show all the extra game characters. But I never actually got as far as doing that, and the one thing that you can see ripped is actually some waves which I found on the 4th edition of Dizzy, Magic Line Dizzy on the Amiga, and I copied and pasted those in. But it became obvious pretty soon that this had to be created on a PC, and I began with the game Hunter, and I ripped that off the Hunter game and I stuck that onto the basic background just to give me a demo of what that would look like. You can see the hills that are already forming in the background, and the tree and the house. So far that's 2 games ripped. Remember the waves here, and here's a close-up of those waves. And I actually had a party ripping from Dizzy 4. Here's a tree from Magic Land Dizzy, and I also ripped the main Dizzy character as well a little later on. But for now, over our basic main introduction, I then extended that to widescreen because I realised that the old 4:3 didn't really work except on the games themselves, and now we animate those waves directly from the rip of the game. And as you can see with animation, it really does take on a life of its own, and of course some clouds wouldn't hurt either, and yes, I ripped these clouds off from Magic Land Dizzy. So those are the clouds, and the exception, of course, there is always one. This sun was taken from Super Frog. If you add those elements together, what you end up with is a number of clouds on a number of layers, all merging away on the horizon, and you can see those moving at different speeds, which is great. And when they overlap each other, well, they are supposed to overlap, but I didn't want too many clouds in the background because of course a nice open sky invites lots of sprites. And at this stage in 2011 I had no idea how this would eventually turn out, and given these humble beginnings, you can see I could have gone either way and added things on different parts of the screen, maybe zoomed up into the sky and panned around that way, but eventually you can see, well, that's the end of the roll. Eventually that's as far as I got by adding clouds at that point. So if we take a look by adding all the other elements, the Hunter will be cut out of the Hunter game. You can see I actually cut out the house and the tree and the landscape separately, and then I could have characters moving ahead and behind those. Here's another rough demo of what that would look like, and one of my favourite games of all time, it has to be said, is Vroom on the Amiga. So on the French course of Vroom you can see a nice horizon, and I also ripped out that hot air balloon so that then animates. And I also borrowed, you can see, the signposts from Lemon Amiga, and those were put onto the horizon, as well as the flowers, which I believe came from Lemon Amiga but originally Super Frog, as did this one, which I cut out from the Super Frog game. And here is an isolated background that I found in Super Frog, and you can see the tree from Super Frog actually made it into the final version. You can see the tree branch just on the corner And after adding even more C elements from the Lemon Amiga website, as well as these two characters that I managed to find on there, then those elements overlaid onto this demo, eventually it began to flesh things out. You can see with the background now faded with a few dots on the horizon, and let's fade those trees into view as well. You can see the super frog trees melting into my jagged hill horizon. But at this stage, when I began to rip sprites for the game, not every attempt worked. You can see this monkey is actually from the Addams family, along with the main sprite Gomez himself. You can see that's not quite perfectly ripped, but by recording some footage and zooming in on that, I could basically box out those characters. But I found as soon as I tried to take those into the editor and try to matte out that background, then all the black disappeared as well. And even though these characters do appear in early versions of this animation, matting out the background, it didn't always work. And sometimes that had to be done pixel by pixel, and sometimes it could be got away with. And in this game I managed to find a nice solid background in the game. You can see some game elements still remaining, but if the game has a nice solid background, I can usually blank that off and mask that away, like Dizzy again from Dizzy 4, and of course the Lemmings. If I can find that great background, then I can simply take that away, and this is what you get. And this of course was perfect for the intro, because that ground, you can see that grass disappears, and in the intro you may notice that that stage disappeared once those lemmings blow up. And you may notice that some things had to be edited in post. You can see this rip of Super Frog. When I isolate that character, it's actually stationary, so I have to edit that myself. And the same thing with this one, because I've actually ripped that in the central position. Unfortunately, every time I move that character, he will then move off the grabbing area, and that, in this case, Tearaway Thomas, meant that that particular character was very hard to animate. And the first samurai, or in this case the second samurai character, again, some of his actions are outside the grab box, and some of his punches are on the edge, and that led to him having to punch the sign, the Lemon Amiga logo. And that led in turn, these are also from Second Samurai, of course, that led in turn to all the action going on as things hit each other. And so this is an early demo of what I ended up with. The Captain Planet is supposed to move behind the house, and the lemmings disappear behind that flower before they blow up. You may also notice a ship, which I picked up from Coral Motion Studio when I had that software that created the spinning logo you saw right at the beginning. And you see right at the beginning of every single introduction, spinning globe. And unfortunately I don't have that software anymore, so that ship got updated. You can find another mushroom I added from Super Frog a bit later on, as well as some bubbles I found in Treasure Island Dizzy, which are very helpful, of course, for the undersea sections, because the crabs can blow these bubbles, and so can the divers. So that really helped to pad out the undersea area. So, of course, when you add those elements together, of course, things begin to build, and you can see already things beginning to come together before I really got together and launched this with the Lemon Amiga reviews. And let's just watch this through. The house is still not there because this is just a demo, but if we add in the crab and the foreground elements, or some of those, then you can see already these tests that I'm putting together. Yes, the Addams Family unicycle still there. Not quite sure whether that's still in the final video, but that's how that ended up being there, and the matte black disappeared. And as we shall see later on, that really did become a problem on some sprites. The Chinaman from Impossible is in there, and the crab we managed to animate to move from its stationary position. And now we can see, even without the Lemon Amiga logos, that some things are now being animated. And the flip that you saw from Tearaway Thomas was completely animated in post-production. I basically took frames of that. This bird you can see is from Exile AGA, which I haven't quite got around to reviewing just yet. Sensible World of Soccer, and yes, the Lemon logo. So when you add those things together with even more foreground elements, the hot air balloon that we found in Vroom now animates, and that boat actually moves up and down as well, bobs around. So now you can see now with the logo, and that's actually split off at the moment, but as I began to use this, it was supposed to be the idea that I'd add the games that I was reviewing to this introduction and point those out. And for that, it was essential to have a stock number of characters at the beginning so that it wasn't completely boring. You can see the Tearaway Thomas actually misses its animation frames there because I had to fix those a little later. But for the most part, that was the introduction. So if you add in the basic introduction that I managed to find, the planet spinning around in Motion Studio, which I no longer have, but I still use that graphic, and you can see the plane came from that same package as well. I merged those two things together, and that's a bit like those classic movie intros that you saw in the 1930s. Here's some raw footage of the Alien Fish Finger, which was the first official game that I tried to use this on.
Lemon Amiga presents a Playtime video review. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Well, a little late on cue there. That actually goes behind the Super Frog character due to overlay problems at that stage, but that was the very first introduction to that cartoon intro. Apart from Locomotion, which it actually wasn't possible to rip great graphics from and put them in because of the view perspective of that thing, I actually took game rips from all the following games that I played in sequence, including Roll or Die, Yogi's Great Escape, or in this case, I think that came from Yogi's Big Cleanup, not quite sure. The X-Wing from Star Wars was successfully ripped, and all stories had to be blanked out. And of course, the famous introduction from the Lotus series, Lotus 1, was ripped, and that led to one of my favourite introductions of all time, which is slightly different, and it led to the famous breakup of the lemon sign. That was the Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge.
Sit back and enjoy the show.
Saw several layering issues which were fixed later on, but that was the initial Lotus intro, and this one again was taken from Turrican 2, and I had to find a nice clear space in the background and do all this editing in post-production. And so that's why the character moves along. Sometimes I could rip things directly from the game itself, and as you saw as part of the intro to this very documentary, I managed to find this little section from Bubble Bobble, and most of the screen was blanked out by blocks, and so that's why most of this is matted out. And as Bubble Bobble backgrounds are black, then you can see the edge of that matted area if I jump out of that. But somewhere in this footage is the part that I actually ripped, and I placed the Bubble character on top of the building, the actual house from Hunter, and he then floats off and has his own adventures. But you can see this was the original rip that I took from Bubble Bobble. If I take out and insert all the blanked areas, you can see how difficult it was, or how easy it was, to rip that character. And the bubbles themselves caused a problem a little later, going outside that box, but again they were fixed in post-production. Moving on to the next character, we find a helicopter which is only just being reviewed. That's cannon fodder. And now you can find a submarine from, guess which game, Blood Money. And we can also find a great tank that was ripped directly from Dune 2. The tank only moves in one direction and then moves in a diagonal, so again all the other pieces of action that thing does was done in post, and no prizes for guessing Dynablaster was ripped as well. And in the end, I didn't even rip this introduction. I simply took the Bomberman and had various goals of trying to get the Bomberman in a background which was actually matted, so that I could actually get a good rip on that, because if you use green, of course the Bomberman is blue, and so no matter what colour you use, you tend to matte out an important character colour. So in the end, it was a compromise, but no such problems with the Rodland character, because I could use blue, there was no green on this character. And so from here I got the explosion, and that gave me the idea to use the bomb to blow it up and to cross games over. And yet again, this is the only animation I ripped from GB Air Rally, a subsequent review which has been banned, and I'll try to get that back online at some point somehow. But using just that stock footage, I managed to create that flight. And you can see here a couple of effects from IK Plus, the Pac-Man, and the worm, which was always my favourite effect on IK Plus. All of those made it into the intro. This is from FA-18 Interceptor, a simple plane blowing up, and you can see the worm from Worms. I had to matte out all of the ground and all of the background, but you can see if I isolate that, it's possible to insert that anywhere on the ground, and it looks like the worm is moving around. It's not amazing 3D, but it seems to work for the intro. And I also added at this point some things that I found as a copy of the Map Chat intro, and I've changed this part of the intro. This is a series of panels from games which I've reviewed or I wanted to review, and so all of the early games, the Settlers, you can see, the first version of Batman the movie is in there, and so halfway through Season 1 I included some games so that I could point those out, and of course Star Wars, the great PP Hammer, which doesn't actually have a character on the intro, and neither does Super Hang-On, but if we put all those elements together, now you can see all those basic elements. Games that never even made it, Swiv never even made it, Stunt Car Racer, and so we did actually take the pier from Monkey Island 2. It isn't on there at the moment because we added that later, but with all those games that were reviewed in Season 1, you can see the GB plane and the Worms worm. We still haven't reviewed Worms, unfortunately. Now the sign crashes down with a Lotus, and the Lemmings blow things up, and now with Project X in the sky, you can see I was trying to get as many interactions going as possible, and things jumping over each other and things blowing things up, and trying to get the layers correct whilst maintaining the correct aspect ratio of all these sprites, which wasn't necessarily easy, and I'm not quite sure whether I managed to do that. And Joey from Beneath the Steel Sky, yet to review that game, and the fish from the very first James Pond game is there. Again, this is the amount that I managed to rip from that, and I had to move that around underwater, avoiding things in post-production. But after some time, I managed to get that rip, and the eyes are actually quite white, which caused a problem, and that's why James Pond has blue eyes. And after that we went on to Project X. Again, I reviewed a little later, and you can see a few of the dots are actually stars in the background of the star field, and again I managed to take those off. Moving on, here we are in January 2012, it's a new season, and for January I actually added the Apidia butterflies, and also separately the Apidia wasps as well. And after all of that was put together, you can see adding that with Project X really worked well, and the Rainbow Islands, and here we are with a stock photograph that I managed to edit of the Drip character. And rough and tumble, sometimes it's not even possible to rip animation until you actually get to the edit itself, and sometimes you can see a very difficult background colour. I've tried to find the very best one to rip in the game, and you can see settling on green, it wasn't possible to save the mouth area, and the night appears green as well. But using this green example, I think I went with the burgundy in the end, but using this green example you can see that, well, quite lots of action goes on, and yes, all of the rest of the background had to be blanked out. In this early version of IK Plus, you can see if it's a little rough around the edges when I turn around, and some characters who are easier than others to rip from games. You can see in this North and South, I tried to vary the backgrounds, try the best rip possible, and I also tried to find the best colour, but you can see it doesn't really matter on a silver colour like this Speedball 2 coin. And this gem is from Gods, and adding the final few, yes, this is the pier I added from the Secrets of Monkey Island 2, which I chopped up, and I slapped that on the side next to the lighthouse on the animation. And so finally with the pier, and the guy sat on the pier, and now we can animate the rough and tumble guy, and he actually gets blown up by the second samurai guy, who gets run over by the lotus, who gets reincarnated as a karate guy who punches, or rather kicks, a guy in the face, and then it goes back in time. You can see various things going on. The drip actually melts because it gets too close to the sun, and that reveals the rainbow for the Rainbow Islands. And Yogi now picks up the coin and also collects the gem as well. And moving on through 2012, here is a section which was eventually the Elite ship. And for games like Boogie Boy, I isolated the animation down to just 2 frames, and by looping those and recording those and then sending those down the screen, it was actually smoother than the game itself. And so some of these are actually playing slower than they appear in the animation. And Deluxe Gallagher, and you can see the guys I took from Syndicate. I used an effect to blow those up, and a character from Zool, which I'll review later on. But at the time I did review Silkworm, and this was my actual raw rip before I added anything to it. And you can see the background there is fairly solid. It's pretty easy to map that out and then animate that so that it crashes out. And here we are with Ivan Stewart's off-road. I found the basic frames of the car, and here are the basic frames of the car turning. And by adding the car turning to a car on its side and moving that, it was possible to move that car and have it turn in the middle and face the opposite way and drive the other way. And so that's how I did that from the actual pictures. And I really wanted to add something in there from Pinball Dreams or Pinball Fantasies, and that was really difficult to match, so in the end I took the basic plunger and used that. But you can see the walker animation was very difficult, and I ended up losing the blacks again. And so by using a mask effect and increasing the blacks background, I then laid that onto the colours in the foreground and tried to restore those. And you can see the blacks still missing from the legs, but by incorporating this stock image and separating out the blood, that led to another favourite intro.
Amiga present.
Intro was for the game Walker.
A Play Giant video review. Sit back and enjoy the show.
The early demo of the Walker, which made it into the intro, was actually very poor, and yet again I went on to fix many of these effects afterwards. And rolling on through to the end of 2012, these are the updates from the new games that I reviewed, and this animated intro sequence has ended up being preserved to this day. You can see the games on there are fairly recent for Season 2, but you can also see they are pretty dated towards the games that we've been playing recently. But some classic games on there. Not quite sure Legends of Valor deserves to be a classic, but you put all those together, it then appears like our modern intro, which we still have to this day. And so that can be added to the traditional intro sequence. And this is the final effect. I started to try the diagonal, but in the end horizontal central line seemed to be best, and I kept that matte black background. And moving on to 2013, in May I ripped the sprite of ATR, as you can see, and that wasn't easy at all. Again, I had to use the black mask trick to try and refill in this bird, which appears in Savage Stage 3, and the tree from Indy 500 was a piece of cake, as was the speedboat that I reincorporated from a very much earlier reviewed game, Outrun Europa. I found a digital image from the Secrets of Monkey Island, which is in there, and the character from Risky Woods, as was the coin and the explosion, got lifted as well, filtered down. Here we are, this is Rampage. Again, some of the backgrounds took a little time to filter out, but that was necessary for all the monster games, and all the historic games got covered with Chuck Rock, and I still haven't done a review of Chuck Rock. The target was added to the walker from the game Take 'Em Out, and the diver from the New Zealand story, and this airplane from Knights of the Sky, which I've slowed down to show you the rip. And out of there came this guy, Olaf from the Lost Vikings. I also added the fish from Soccer Kid, and again messed around with the backgrounds on that, and a variety of cars. This car was actually taken from Supercars 2, stuck together from the wall and re-edited so that it looked a lot like this. And then I also took another car, I think that was from Supercars 2, the model sprite itself, and I messed around with that. And I also took the basic Ferrari from Test Drive 2 and added sides to that. And we found the No Second Prize bike, and that's the Ankh from Yo-Jo, but that all led to the classic Test Drive 2 introduction, with all the cars setting off in a race, and again that's one of my favourite intros.
Sit back and enjoy the show.
This Spy Who Loved Me character was very difficult to rip, and as you can see I only managed to rip maybe a few seconds worth of footage and carefully cut that bit out, but conversely taking this from the title screen of Snow Bros was very easy indeed. In fact, it was a direct rip without any alterations whatsoever. So all of these items ended up in the intro, and for the update to the Lotus series I found the basic introduction from Lotus 2, and by manipulating that and changing that to the 16:9 format with that background, I then mirror exactly what the Lotus Esprit did in Lotus 1, and that replaced that. You can see a very slowed down Dogs of War, which ended up getting in there, and this S was taken of course from Sensible World of Soccer, and again that only appears when slow motion scenes are apparent in the game, but really not used much anymore. And you can see I chose at least 2 different backgrounds, and this flask never made it. That's actually from Savage, but I add the water skier from Beach Volley and attached that to the Outrun Europa speedboat to create yet another effect. Moving on to January 2014, and yes, these things usually in batches of January and May. You can see the great character from Putty Squad was animated on the screen in a number of different ways. This is the Raw Star from Crazy Cars 3, which is put at the end of the rainbow. You can see this item appears in the tree as a symbol. That's actually from Killing Game Show. The hybrid ship was animated from a picture of that. You can see some dots remaining from a rough clip, and one of my better arts was taking this Jaguar image from the introduction to Jaguar and animating that with actual lights from an actual Jaguar XJ220 and mirroring the Lotus effect. This woman is of course from APB, and the starship from Guardian makes it, and to actually commemorate Unreal we took the dragon from the score table. And finally Typhoon Thompson rounded out that year, and the Christmas special was of course Batman the movie, which I took from aside-on shots from that. In 2015 we all came back together in May, and the first thing I added to the new introduction was this rabbit from Wiz and Liz, which I have reviewed recently, and that snuck on. Most people never noticed that until I reviewed the game itself, but more obviously this character from Liquid Kids was animated down the screen, as was this character from Arabian Nights, the ship from Stardust, the helicopter from Desert Strike, and also the animated owl from the Psygnosis game Agony. It was also time to update the ship, and I found this ship from High Seas Trader, I think it was. Took out the background, of course, and that replaced the old ship, and I made that actually move up and down just like the old ship, although you probably don't really notice that much. You can see slightly that the ship moves up and down. And after adding the final characters from games, which you've seen reviewed already, some of which were animated, and you can see, well, some of those were very difficult to cut out, including this monkey, which didn't really make it in any great effect. Well, that led up to the animated sequence that you can see today. This is the animation in full with more fleshed out characters. Hopefully all the overlap has been sorted out and all the breaks which you saw in that raw footage has been fixed, and with all these characters going on interacting with each other, it really is great, and it makes the screen feel exciting with all this action, and it prepares the watcher hopefully to be anticipated by another Play Guide review. And so this is the complete animation as far as it got to date, and I haven't really wanted to add more characters simply because there isn't much room on the screen to fit more characters in. But you can see it's been great fun creating this, and if we let that play through, that's the actual raw file, and it's great to see that in action. All of this was created in a package called Video Studio, run by Coral on the PC, and you can see that that is in 4:3 dimension because I'm using a 4:3 TV, yes, an old CRT TV, to present this, which I've preserved from the Amiga days, and that is why this screen is quite square. But you can see that the intro was built up in several stages. The waves and the clouds in the sky actually move independently, and because I'm only given 20 tracks at the moment in this editor, I can layer up to 20 objects on top of each other, and from there you render things one on top of another and compress things together so that you can add more on top of that. So the very basic layer, which I created in 2011, is this animation of the clouds rolling along, and that was important because each cloud must overlap each other at certain points, and so that has to be right, and all those elements take up quite some room. You can see on what we call the timeline, and a little extra at the end was created for whatever reason, just in case I wanted to extend that in the future. We can also add extra elements to our timeline by simply adding a link to another file which contains another timeline, and in here you can see some more background elements which won't affect anything in the main video. They can stay static in the background, and by turning those on and off you can see their relative positions. You can see there that the ship in the background that is supposed to move up and down, and some of these elements you can see are made up of smaller blocks. In this case you can see all those red blocks, they refer to the lemmings in the background, and as they disappear from view, those small blocks are actually simply repeated so that I didn't have to render that off as a new animation. I simply copied blocks of characters across the screen, and you can see plenty of room to extend that, but those added additions are on the add file to the very background, and when that gets rendered off, then on top of that file, which is the background file, then we have the midground file, and this contains all the background elements you can see in the very first layer, which if I turn off, then you can see all the elements in the mid file, and those elements are really have to be beyond the background and have to be sometimes in the foreground, and it has to be said that sometimes some elements do cross over, and it's sometimes difficult to add foreground and background characters and make those overlap, and especially matching that up to the foreground file, which we shall see at the moment. You can see on the very top timeline the Rampage character has been doubled, and some of his movements have been mirrored so that it looks like he walks one way across the screen and then another, and key elements from the Rampage character, like him bending down, punching things, and hopefully grabbing that Pac-Man. And well, that Pac-Man disappears one frame before he grabs it, but he's supposed to grab that and swallow that, just as the character from Choke Rock jumps in and beats the living daylights out of him. So some of the timeline you can see is a straight animation that just plays straight through, and they are layered one on top of each other, so that hopefully the more foreground they are, the better. And sometimes those are straightforward, like the June tank, which moves in a straight line, and that is then mirrored, and it then drives backwards again with some extra elements added towards the end. And you can see altogether these elements really do pile up, but one of the difficult aspects, it has to be said, above all else, was the Tearaway Thomas character, which you are seeing at the moment. Whatever that Tearaway Thomas is, he definitely needed frame by frame animation. You can see as I step through those frames, I took the keyframes from the actual animation of the character jumping up and rolling around, and I had to use those one after the other to simulate the character jumping into the water. And so in that case, that was not taken directly from an animation, that definitely was edited frame by frame. And so I have used a variety of techniques, as you've seen, to get the most basic characters on the screen. Sometimes it is easy, sometimes it is hard, and sometimes they have to be broken up and manually edited, shifted around that screen, and sometimes they can just be laid in. This is the foreground track, you can see, and all the foreground elements are added. We have the mix down, which is the mid track, you can see on the very top layer, and that contains everything that we have already. If we turn that off, then you can see the foreground elements and the things which in this case really don't interact with any of the characters. And you can see that all together now they really do start to fill up that screen. The sky is usually interpreted as an open variety, so I can put that anywhere I like on the timeline because the sky is open, that's no problem. Sometimes in the water, by the time we get to this third timeline, I can place anything I like in the water, and so you will find foreground elements in the sky as well. But look at that, and yet again on the top line we find some more elements. That is the drip character, and yet again, instead of creating an animation and rendering that off, I simply decided to edit the character block by block, moment by moment, second by second across that screen, and make him float up and down. And I could have done that a lot easier way, but again I could have rendered that off as well, but no, I chose to keep the original, and that was rendered from an actual picture, a static picture on its own, and I couldn't actually grab a great rip from the drip game itself, so I just used that static character. And so it's very full at this stage with all these different elements you can see, and it takes my computer some time and quite some lag to catch up to my every command. This doesn't usually affect my performance when editing videos, but in this case, editing this introduction, it really does lag, and if I wanted to change something in the very background, I would have to compile that, and then the midground, and then the foreground, and that's one whole day of a job. But it's surprising how these characters came together and interacted with each other. They seem to move in different places, and I added extra elements so they would crash and bang into each other and pop and explode and that kind of thing. So you can see a lot of time and effort has been built up into this, and the original idea was to have these characters so that I could point out the game in the introduction, and that grew and grew. Sometimes the characters are already in there and I did want to review those at some stage, and sometimes I add those extra elements as I'm going along. but because it takes so long to rip these things and edit those down block by block, sometimes it's very difficult. Taking a look at some of the rips individually, you can see this is from Wiz and Liz, and this game footage was taken straight from the game itself. You can see various elements in the background which I had to mask off using layers in the foreground. You can see if we simply loop that footage, it will loop and repeat on its own. So all we need to do is to edit a number of frames, i.e. one complete jump, and we can have the rabbits hopping around forever. And so all we did is add a mask layer, a background layer, which we can then take away. In this case it's a nice green colour because that does not matter with the orange and the red of the main character. And I used extra bars where necessary to get rid of the black background from around the character, which has been preserved in this case, and some extra elements as well, just to trim that background away and keep that shadow as close to the character as possible. So we can use the chroma key effect on the main characters in order to appear straight through the black and replace that with the green, but by using the chroma that also sometimes gets rid of the black in the center of the character, which creates holes which we have to fill in behind the animated frame. You can see those on the second and third timeline. Those are actually there to fill in the gaps, and because that moves with every frame, then that shadow that I've had to fill in moves with every frame, and therefore I've had to move that block by block, bit by bit. Sometimes you can get the program to do that for you, but in this case I've done that manually. You can see if I click through those, the shadow behind the character actually moves with it. And so, as I say, some characters are pretty easy, but some characters take quite a lot of this masking to basically get rid of the background of the game and replace that with a solid colour, which we can then chroma out later on. And here we go with another one. This is from Arabian Nights, and yet again we mask out the see-through areas, the chromed areas, using black, and we crop very close to the icon so there's no trailing areas, and it's very hard, in fact impossible, to spot that those trailing areas appear. But yes, by adding these extra layers we can get rid of them and trim up that icon. Thank you very much for viewing this history of the characters in the amazing cartoon instruction. Hope to see you again soon.